another week of class. As you all are likely aware, this marks just over the halfway point into the semester. You all are getting a little bit of a break this week. Very much appreciated, I'm sure. The video lecture that I have planned is actually going to be quite short. And I feel like I always start out my video lectures saying that, and then they end up being around the same time. This week, I assure you, is going to be much more brief than in prior weeks. Before I say what I have to say about the introduction to inequality, I did want to bring your attention to an error that I just noticed in our course schedule. I had originally scheduled us to read, I believe it's chapter 13 out of our textbook, Inequality and Achievement. That needs to be postponed until we talk about class inequality. So for this week, even though there are no forums, you still have 2 readings that you need to complete, both of which will be accessed online through our course website. One is titled False Parallels. It comes from a textbook written by Michael Schwalbe. And the second one is Gender and Other Socially Constructed Prisms. It's about intersectionality, and it comes from a reader that I use when I teach my gender course. Excuse me. Okay, so now that announcement is out of the way, let me go ahead and say a few things about this week's topic, which is the introduction to inequality. So at the beginning of the semester, we spent some time talking about what the sociological perspective is, what sociologists do in their profession. Then we talked a little bit about the building blocks of sociology, if you will. We spoke about culture and socialization and deviance, social structure, social institutions. For the remainder of the class, we will be focusing our attention on inequality, which is kind of at the foundation of sociology as a discipline, and it's certainly at the foundation of who I am as a sociologist, not only in terms of how I teach, but also the research that I do. I am, to refresh your memory, an inequality scholar that focuses on race and immigration specifically. So one thing that I wanted to say in regards to introducing us to this topic of inequality is this. I want to issue a bit of a disclaimer. So the way that I teach, the way that I approach inequality is from a very critical perspective. And what I mean by that is that what I fundamentally focus on is systems of oppression and marginalization, power and privilege in our society. And these are sometimes topics that can make us feel quite uncomfortable, especially if we are members of dominant groups, if we are members of groups that receive privilege as a result of the structure of our society. And so some of you, as we read through the material, as we are posting on our forums, some of you may feel uncomfortable, uneasy, angry, dismissive of the material that's being presented to you. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to say that all of those emotional reactions are absolutely understandable. They're perfectly normal. We live in a world where inequalities are often hidden, especially from those that benefit from those inequalities. Those groups that are marginalized by inequalities tend to be acutely aware of their existence, and there's obviously a reason for that. But for those who have never really encountered these ideas before, to face them, especially to face them in a classroom setting, can be quite unsettling. And so while I can recognize and appreciate those icky emotional responses, I urge you to the best of your ability to, one, push through them, to try to see the material for what it is, to kind of set those emotions aside and approach the material analytically. So distance yourself from that emotional response as much as you possibly can. And then secondly, examine that emotional response, because that is a product of our social world. So why is it that learning about white privilege, for example, would make you so angry? Why is it that learning about male privilege would evoke feelings of dismissiveness or uncomfortableness or guilt? Guilt is a frequent emotion that students of dominant groups often express to me when we go through this material. Okay, so there's that. As I mentioned a moment ago, one of the readings for this week talks about false parallels. Schwalbe is an amazing writer, so I think that the main points that he's getting at here will be very clear to most of you. But just to kind of provide additional clarification or to sum up his argument in a nutshell, what he's really getting at here is that whenever we talk about inequality, whenever we examine inequality, there are three things that we need to consider: history, power, and context. Because individuals in our society, no matter what groups they are members of, whether they are part of dominant groups or marginalized groups, may encounter obstacles of some sort. They may encounter some barriers of one variety or the other. But we need not think that just because we all encounter that turmoil, that it's all equal, right? Marginalization is kind of the key here, in that systems of oppression, systems of inequality are structured in such a way that marginalized groups are subordinated, oppressed, whereas dominant groups receive these unearned privileges. And again, this is the structure of our society. A lot of this may make more sense as we start talking about race and gender and class. The second reading for today's or for this week's material focuses on what is referred to as an intersectional perspective. So this is basically the idea that whenever you're thinking or talking about inequality, you need to consider a multitude of social prisms simultaneously. And social prisms is that's the terminology used by these authors, Spade and Valentine. But what they're really getting at here are the groups that we belong to. So what are some examples of social prisms in our world? Gender, race, class, religion, sexual orientation, able-bodiedness. All of these are social prisms. All of these are statuses, as we learned a couple of weeks ago. All of these are statuses that we occupy. And at one point in the discipline of sociology, people would study race separately. They would study gender. They would study class. They would study sexual orientation separately, as though these things weren't related. Yet we intuitively know that that's not the case, that we experience all these things simultaneously. As is quite abundantly clear to most of you, I would suspect, if I'm thinking about myself from an intersectional perspective, I would say that I am a white woman in a straight relationship that has a middle class background. And then I can go on and on and on and talk about a variety of other social prisms that my lives intersect with. And so basically the point here is that when you're talking about gender, there's a racialized component to gender. There is a classed component to gender, for example. So white men experience masculinity vastly different than do black men. And to go further, working class white men experience masculinity different than does an upper class black man. And you can add these layers on and on and on to really get at the complexity of our social world and our systems of inequality. So I am at 9:30, so like I said, that is significantly shorter than prior video lectures. I'm going to call that good for this week. We will pick up next week. I think we're talking about race, which again is kind of my area of research, so I am especially eager to commence a discussion over that topic. I hope you all have a wonderful fall break. Stay healthy and well, and rest as much as you are possible or able to. Bye.